The title of my speech is The Intersection of Animal Health and Political Pressures, and I wrote that and realized that it sounded like a really boring veterinary school lecture, so then I tried to shorten it and I said pandemics and politics, and I realized that that's everyone's two least favorite words, so we're off to a good start. Of all the animal diseases foreign to the U.S., this is from a USDA APHIS statement, of all of the animal diseases foreign to the U.S., blank presents the greatest threat to the livestock industry and economy. It is a priority for preparedness research, response and research. What disease do you think that might be? You're right, I heard it in the audience. It is foot and mouth disease. And ever since vet school, any kind of lecture we've had from USDA in the veterinary profession, they seem incredibly terrified of this disease. And honestly, if they're terrified, you should be terrified. So what is foot and mouth disease? Foot and mouth disease is a highly contagious viral disease, so antibiotics does not touch it. It affects cows, pigs, sheep, goats, deer, and any other cloven-hooved animal. The primary clinical symptoms are fever and blisters on the tongue and lips, in and around the mouth, on the mammary glands, and around the hooves. And the key here is the most affected animals will not die from foot and mouth. They will simply be basically unusable, unproductive animals. And so it does not cause an outbreak that would necessarily incite fear or incite your attention, because it does not, you're not going to walk out in your pasture and see 50 dead animals in one day. What you're going to see are these lesions. And so the virus survives in living tissue, breath, saliva, urine, and other excretions. And this is an important factor right here. Let's see, where's my slides? Oh, they're not up. Can we get those? Thank you. So the virus can survive in contaminated materials in the environment for several months, and that's a key factor right there. So there's 7 known types and more than 60 subtypes of the foot and mouth virus. And immunity to one subtype does not protect against the other subtypes, and that makes vaccination very difficult. So what are the consequences of a potential foot and mouth outbreak in the United States? So the USDA says it would likely stop international trade and meat trade completely. It's not a public health concern. There is a human foot and mouth and hand virus that is not related to this virus. It potentially, though, could cause some confusion at the consumer level if we were to have an outbreak. The impact is threefold. So extermination of positive animals would lead to reduction in demand for feedstuffs. The termination of the export markets, consumer and market fear, the commodity markets would likely freak out in the event of an outbreak, and then decreased meat demand as a result of the decreased consumer demand. So we've spoken to a lot of economists today. I'm not one of them. I'm an animal health person. So there are a variety of forecasts of what this could potentially do to the economic market and the commodities market here in the U.S. One of them is the 2011 Iowa State study. It suggested that potentially over a 10-year period we could experience $130 billion in losses, and that's specific to the pork and beef industry alone. This graph here is from the 2011 Iowa State study, and it is a percent change in the baseline price in U.S. steers and heifers over a period where an outbreak would occur in 2011. And in this outbreak, the models projected it would take about 5 to 6 years to even return back to a break-even point in the market. And so I don't know how you could look at your operation, but it'd be fairly difficult for any operation to expect to survive a 5-year period where they're not even breaking even. An economic equivalent loss of 58,000 full-time jobs. And it would lead to a devastation in the beef, pork, lamb, and then also the corn and soybean industries would be impacted because of the reduced feedstuff demand. So what would we do in the event of an outbreak? I think that's an important question to ask. There's 3 established protocols for the event of an outbreak. Number 1 is stamping out. That's probably what you've heard before. Basically a depopulation of all clinically affected animals, and those in contact with those animals would be depopulated. The second would be stamping out with vaccination. And so that's kind of a more modern approach. The USDA is kind of leaning that way on a lot of their current documents. But depopulation of the clinically affected animals and then in contact animals, and then vaccination of all other animals that would be at risk. And then those vaccinated animals would be allowed to live out their lives. The second option would be stamping out with vaccination to kill. And that would be same as above, kill the impacted animals and the in-contact animals, vaccinate the animals that are at risk, but then eventually you want to get an offspring from those animals that are negative, keep that offspring, kill the animals that were vaccinated. This occurs because once you vaccinate an animal, you cannot distinguish it from a positive or exposed animal in testing. And so the important thing to remember about this is this bottom half. You can either prioritize a rapid return to foot and mouth free status, or you can minimize the loss of animals. You cannot do both at the same time. So in your response, you have to pick one of these two options. And it's kind of like picking the best of two bad outcomes. So remember that as we move forward. So looking back in history, there's been two big outbreaks that have kind of framed the US's response and strategy to our plan on how to deal with an outbreak. And the first was the UK 2001 outbreak. And I think everyone in this room has probably heard of this outbreak in the past. It's pretty well known. They had 6 million animals that were depopulated in the process of that outbreak, and it cost approximately $9 billion. All susceptible animals within a 3-kilometer radius, regardless of whether they were infected or not, were depopulated. Additional animals were also depopulated due to lack of demand, because once the inefficiencies in the market occurred, similar to the COVID situation in the swine here in the US, there were impacts in the market. Despite all control and elimination efforts, the virus spread to both Ireland, France, and the Netherlands. So there was also another outbreak of foot and mouth in 2001. It did not get as much press. It was in Uruguay. So they chose the approach of stamping out with vaccination to live. They utilized 24 million doses of vaccine in that process, and only a little less than 7,000 animals were depopulated. And so if you go back to the comparison of, let's see if we can go back there. The comparison of the UK, quite difference in the cost and also the animals that were impacted. Cost at the time was $730 million, but they continue to vaccinate to this day, and that's a decision that Uruguay made because of their proximity to Argentina. Argentina is pretty much endemic with foot and mouth disease, and the Uruguayan authorities feel like they will always be at risk for exposure to foot and mouth because of their trade association with Argentina, and so they have chosen to continue to vaccinate. Obviously, there's an ongoing cost for that vaccination. The challenges, however, from that is that there are so many strains of foot and mouth disease, as we went over earlier, that it is difficult to make sure that you have the right vaccine for that strain. And lots of times, less developed countries can't keep large banks of vaccine of every single subtype on hand to quickly bring up in the event of an outbreak. And also, as I mentioned earlier, vaccinated animals cannot be differentiated from exposed animals via testing. And they are currently trading under the FMD-free, where vaccination is practiced, OIE trade label. And this does limit their exposure to some export markets. So what about in the USA? So in the event of an outbreak, animal health officials will carefully consider the use of vaccination. If it becomes apparent at any point that a stamping out strategy will not effectively eliminate disease, we will immediately consider alternate strategies, including vaccination. And that's directly from a USDA APHIS statement. And so it is kind of vague. It's hard to find in the USDA documents exactly a step-by-step approach, because it is kind of, we're going to see what's going to happen and we're going to try to make a policy given these different scenarios. And so they have a variety of scenarios kind of mapped out, but who knows how it's going to actually go down. So, time to play a game. Stress like a vet. So, in the current status of how this is designed, there's a heavy influence on your local veterinarian being the one that detects this problem should it show up in the United States. So, you get to pretend to be me now. So in these two photos, one of these photos will require you as the veterinarian to tell the producer that every single animal on their premise is going to have to be exterminated. The other one just requires a call to the local state, probably a quarantine, some paperwork. Can you tell the difference before I put that up? I can't tell the difference. I hope someone in this room can tell the difference. It's my job to tell the difference, and I cannot. Okay, another picture. Got some mouth lesions, tongues here, close-up of tongues. One of these diseases will shut down the export market in the US. It will cause billions of dollars of damage. And the other one, we need to call the state, write some paperwork, quarantine, typical stuff. Which one is it? It's my job to figure out which one of these. It's the less severe lesion. Final one, because it causes these types of lesions on the feet, around the coronary band of the foot. One of these will cause huge trade implications, panic in the markets. You have to call in the troops immediately. The other one requires maybe a couple shots of LA-200 and some rest. One of these is foot rot, and one of these is foot and mouth disease. Which one is it? So now you have an idea of how hard this distinguishment is. So what is the point of this game? So the point of this game is that in vet school they teach us that the ideal scenario in an outbreak is early identification, isolation, trace back, and control of the outbreak. How can we expect the veterinarians of this country to adequately isolate and find this virus if it looks like foot rot? Because how many of you have had foot rot in the last few months? Probably most people in this room. Did you call your vet and say, oh, we might have foot and mouth? How many animals in your herd would you have to have these lesions before you called your vet to come look at it? Because again, they're not dropping dead. If you walked out tomorrow and had 50 dead animals, you'd for sure call your vet. If you walked out tomorrow and had 50 cases of foot rot, you'd go, well, maybe the ground's too soft, or it's too hard, or we've got debris in the pasture. And so the whole argument of we need traceability, we need RFID, we need premise identification is based on the fact that we have this setup in place: early identification, traceability, isolation. If we don't have early identification, do we really need traceability? Is that the focus of what we should be focusing on, or is it something else we should be focusing on? So, foot and mouth, how are we going to get it here? Domestic threat. There's a domestic threat, there's a foreign threat. We'll go over domestic threat first. So my dad, when I was younger, would always say, beware when they say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And this is an example of that. Historically in the US, we have isolated our research and examination of foreign animal diseases to the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. It's on an island just off of Long Island in New York. They've been there for 60 plus years. Their argument was that it's an outdated facility, they need better facility, and they chose to put their new National Bio and Agro Defense Facility in Manhattan, Kansas, right in the heart of cattle country. I'm sure you've all heard of that at this point. So, National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, the construction was actually completed this year in the spring. It cost about $1.25 billion, and the research is slated to start in 1 to 2 years. They have to do some testing and whatnot to get going. It's the first ever biosecurity level 4 lab in the United States capable of housing livestock, large livestock, and it is located adjacent to the Kansas State University campus, but according to documents, is entirely operated by the USDA and separate from K-State. This is an important thing to remember. It's what's led to some issues over there, because also Kansas State also operates the Biosecurity Research Institute, which is an existing level 3 biosecurity research lab, and they have stated on their own website that they have already been using this research facility to jumpstart research that will be eventually transitioned to the new federal facility. Why is that a problem? Okay, well, in 2015, federal regulators cited KSU for failing to comply with 9 of the 10 types of safety and security requirements. This included biosafety and containment practices, incident response, security plan requirements, and the training of staff. And this wasn't just on one of the federal inspections. This was on 4 consecutive federal inspections of that lab. And they continue to state that these are going to be 2 separate facilities. However, they're located adjacent to each other. They're clearly utilizing this lab to jumpstart the research. And it's located in the central part of the US in cattle country. And so understandably, Kansas legislatures were nervous about that. And so they went ahead and formulated Kansas Senate Bill 441, the Biological Laboratory Accident Transparency Act. It was going to require institutions and organizations to report accidents and near-miss accidents at high-risk biological laboratories. There is not a lot of transparency right now in the current statutes that require them to tell you when they have mess-ups. And I think that we're on the right path with this bill. However, it passed the Senate and then died in the House committee on May 23rd of this year. So, what's the foreign threat? Brazil, our favorite South American country. Historically, Brazil has struggled with foot and mouth. Since 2018, they've been vaccinating, similar to Uruguay, and trading under the free of foot and mouth disease with vaccination status through federal trade organizations in the OIE. However, in November of this year, they're going to suspend vaccination against foot and mouth in their 6 main states where it's at, which means 13 million cattle and buffalo will no longer be vaccinated, which is roughly half of Brazil's total herd. And the Brazilian government's goal is to achieve the status with the OIE of being deemed free from disease without vaccination by 2026. So this is an interesting chart. Bill went over yesterday the impacts financially of the beef imports. This is another chart from the USDA. That's monthly beef imports from Brazil. Historically, we have not allowed fresh beef imports into the US because of disease concerns. However, in February of 2020, we lifted the ban. So this green line is heat-treated imports. Blue line is fresh imports. And we started allowing the fresh imports in February of 2020. Then, if you'll notice, in September of 2021, we had some drought-impacted supplies in Australia. And then concurrently, China actually banned Brazilian beef imports due to animal health concerns. At the exact same time is when we saw a spike in imports of fresh Brazilian beef, and probably likely due to the fact that the Chinese market was 40% of Brazilian export market. So what does that mean? There's been a lot of concern on whether or not foot and mouth can be introduced through fresh meat imports, and there's been a lot of research that has tried to ensure us that the risk is relatively low. I would agree that probably direct exposure would have to be like where contaminated feed or tissues were fed to susceptible animals in the US, which is highly unlikely given our current feed structure, but I mean, not implausible. However, I think that this part is the part that doesn't get a lot of attention. And so anytime you increase trade, you're going to increase traffic, right? So when there's businesses that are going back and forth between Brazil, you're going to have people that are going between the two areas, carrying fomites on them, and also the other part is imported feedstuffs. So during the 2020 pandemic, how many of you had issues getting mineral or getting feedstuffs or imports into your facility, into your ranch? This was likely due to the fact that those feedstuffs or those minerals or components of that product were from foreign markets. And foreign markets have lower standards, and they could potentially be introducing fomites on those products to your cattle. This was a big deal with African swine fever. I was in meetings when African swine fever first showed up in China that the Department of Homeland Security showed up to. And that was the first veterinary meetings I've ever been to that we had, FBI agents and Department of Homeland Security in. So I paid attention. And the biggest concern was that we were going to get those fomites coming into the country on feedstuffs, on the minerals and stuff that the pig industry in the US is completely dependent on because we don't manufacture it at all in the US. We've been so focused on getting the price down and getting it for the cheapest amount of money that we've outsourced all the sourcing of these ingredients to foreign countries. And now it is a significant risk that fomites will be introduced on those feedstuffs to the US. And remember, foot and mouth disease can survive in contaminated materials and the environment for several months under the right conditions. So it could very well be in a foodstuff that's packed in a container and shipped to the US and survive there and then be fed to your animal and transmit. So what are the opportunities here? Because I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I want to give us some opportunities to focus on as far as where we can go with this information. So we need to refocus. We need to ensure that the increased funding and disease surveillance and research that the U.S. is currently doing on foreign animal disease, because part of the side effect of COVID was that the government remembered how important zoonotic disease is, because COVID is essentially considered a zoonotic disease, or a disease that can be transmitted between humans and animals. So a lot of money is flowing into this space right now. And so we need to make sure as an organization that this money is properly directed. Because in my mind, there's other diseases, foreign animal diseases out there, and traceability might be more helpful on those diseases, but not with the greatest threat, foot and mouth disease. It's not as helpful in my viewpoint. We need to make sure that this money is being directed to the right areas, because we're not going to stop the flow of the money. The money is going to go in that realm. It needs to go to the right areas that are actually going to help the industry. And there's a lot of players out there that do not want increased red tape on the import side of things. They're going to be putting the focus on domestic regulations and domestic red tape and domestic things to be done. And I'm not certain that that's the proper place for it. So also, prevention. We need to control potential domestic risk in the Kansas lab and prevent foreign fomite importation. And so I think we need to get behind and help. We've helped in other areas with the Kansas legislature within our group when we were talking about private property rights yesterday. We need to help our friends in Kansas make sure that the proper regulatory framework surrounds this lab so that it does not become a Wuhan situation. And as far as the international exposures, we need to make sure, right now, if you've ever traveled internationally, you come through customs and they say, have you been on a farm or ranch? Well, how many people want to voluntarily be harassed more after a long international flight when they get back to the country? There's not a lot of incentive for someone to be like, oh yeah, I tromped these boots all over South America. Come put me in a private room and give me a hard time. So there needs to be some sort of greater and more effective surveillance preventing fomite transfer on human traffic. And then also, we need to seriously look at the potentials and risks of bringing in fomites on our feedstuffs and inputs into our market from a foreign market. And then response. We need to be involved in structuring the response to a potential outbreak now. Because if an outbreak were to happen tomorrow, the USDA isn't going to be really receptive to us going, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't want to do, vaccinate to live or vaccinate to kill. We want to do this other option. The time for input into how this is going to be handled is not the day that the outbreak occurs, it's now. So these are kind of the three areas in which I think that we can focus on as an organization to impact a potential outbreak. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you for being here today. I am one of your friends from Kansas. And I'm not sure if you were aware or not. I don't think it's FMD, but there was a large population of dead cows that turned up allegedly in it would be southwestern Kansas, and there's a whole lot of shrouding, nothing to be seen here, but there was concern about what actually happened and what. So I guess have you heard about that? Have you done any looking into that? Were you aware of that?
Sure, yeah, and that is in a situation where it's kind of the typical what we expect or a large-scale disease outbreak to look at. All of a sudden, we've got all these dead cattle, and there was a lot of investigation into that as to what might have happened or what did happen. I'm confident that it was properly sussed out as far as a heat-related issue and not a foreign animal disease issue. I don't think that there would be any sort of cover-up necessarily involved with how it played out. There was a lot of concern and issue around it, and I think that that's appropriate in any type of scenario like that. There should be a fair amount of questioning and further investigation to figure out what exactly went on. But I think it woke some people up for sure, because you're living your life, in this, it's very easy to get kind of in your own vein or hole in this industry, and then all of a sudden something like that happens, and it makes you kind of rethink, like, what if that was a foreign animal disease incident? How susceptible are we to some sort of bioterrorism event? And I think that's an important thing and an important conversation to have.
Yeah, John Hanson from KC, Wyoming. Isn't it true if we got foot and mouth disease that all cloven hoof animals, that'd be wildlife included? We'd never get it stamped out if we got it in Wyoming. It would go through all the wildlife that is inaccessible for vaccinations or anything like that. I mean, we'd have it forever in this country if we ever got it.
Yeah, and that is a huge concern because of the fact that it affects cloven-hoofed animals, and we have so many cloven-hoofed wildlife animals in a lot of our states that have interaction and have fence line interaction with our domestic populations. How would we address that? Because there's a whole nother, I think you can talk to ranchers and they can reasonably understand the idea of we need to control populations, we need to isolate, quarantine, et cetera, but when you start talking with wildlife groups and start talking depopulation and all of this, it's not going to be an easy discussion, and there's going to be a lot of pushback on that. And they already do allow with brucellosis and things like that, the current wildlife populations to continue to be endemic with a disease that can affect livestock, and they don't depopulate or control that. And so it'd be hard to expect them to do anything different in a concurrent event.
One more from me. I just have one question. As a producer, I guess I kind of put that whole level of thought on Plum Island and this disease outbreak towards animal health. But after listening to you, which, by the way, thanks for the great presentation, it is a property rights issue. So what should we do as an organization to mitigate that issue that could come from the laboratory in Kansas immediately? What can we do that would actually make a difference? Do we need to pass policy? Do we need to write letters? What is your suggestion?
Well, I did not have enough time to go into exactly why that bill died in the Kansas House Committee, but I think that we need to make sure that we put our full force behind those types of opportunities and scenarios, because I do agree that is a crossover issue between private property rights and animal health. And so you're kind of getting two birds with one stone there. And I had limited time to put all this information kind of together, and I wanted to be bite-sized enough that you could take it home and utilize it. But I think that any types of opportunities to reinstate that or rewrite that legislation, or to evaluate what other areas we can help them kind of make sure that we've got an eyeball on what's going on. Because ultimately, like, labs are run by people, and people are not perfect. So there's always going to be a chance, no matter what lab or who's associated or who's running it, there's always going to be a chance for mistakes to occur. And I think that transparency is an important part of having control over that issue. Because if all mistakes are just kind of shoved under the rug, then we don't really know what's going on in that scenario, or what even our risk is that we're dealing with. And so there needs to be, the research needs to occur, because we need to know, how we can advance and protect ourselves against these diseases. But we also need to have it in a venue that is not going to increase our risk domestically.